Some of you might know that last year I got the opportunity, along with my wife, to go with a couple from our church who took us to the Penn State-Michigan State game over in Lansing. And I have to share with you that it was a bit of a miserable experience. Not because of the company. My wife and I love that couple to death. It was a bit of a miserable experience because Penn State lost, and my wife and I are from Pennsylvania, so we root for them. But it was mostly a miserable experience because of the weather. It was freezing cold, and not only that, I kid you not, from the moment we sat down in our seats, for 3.5 hours, it snowed and did not stop. Just constant. And not only that, it was also windy on top of it. And so if you're not picking up on this yet, I don't do very well when it comes to the cold. And so by like the third quarter, when the warmers in my boots had worn off, I was just praying for some warmth from somewhere. But as I was watching the game, and as I think back on that experience, one of the things I realized is that it wasn't nearly as miserable for the players in the game as it was for me in the stands. You could tell that they were loving it, that they were enjoying being in that game, they were enjoying playing in the snow, and I could tell why, because I grew up as a little boy dreaming of playing a substantial football game in front of tens of thousands of people in weather just like that, and I realize now, when I look back on that experience, that I would have had a much better experience if I were actually playing in the game instead of sitting in the stands trying not to die of hypothermia. And what I want us to think about this morning is that there's too many times where we as Christians, we settle for just that. We settle for sitting in the stands when we could be playing the game. And our culture sets us up for this. I don't know if you've been to a concert recently, but if you go to a concert that you paid to go to, it's extremely unlikely that there's ever going to be a scenario where you get there and someone comes running up to you out of breath and they're like, "Oh, thank God you're here. Could you help us run sound? Like, could you just come over here to the board? We'll teach you how to do it. It'll be good." Like, no one's asking you to help set up chairs when you get there. No, it's all put together for you. You just sit down in your seat, sit back, enjoy the show, maybe look through the swag bag that you got on your way in. And that kind of mentality, like we are being discipled into a mentality that says that life is about sitting back and being entertained, and that mentality seeps its way into the church, where we start to look at this gathering, what we do every week, as one of those entertainment venues where I get to sit back and soak and be fed, and that's not what Jesus has called us to. In fact, the biggest thing that I want you to remember today, it's the thing I want you to get from everything we talk about for the rest of our time together, is simply this: we are not spectators. We're not spectators. That's what we see in our passage for today, Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 16, where the Apostle Matthew, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, records these words of Jesus for us. "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Jesus is making an extremely bold statement about who we are as Christians and how that identity works out in our lives. And he starts out by telling us that we are salt. Let's look at verse 13 real quick again. It says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot." So Jesus uses this metaphor of salt to help describe who we are. He says that we're the salt of the earth. And if that's a metaphor, the question we have to ask is, what does it mean? What does it mean for us to be salt? Well, one of the things that salt was used for in Jesus' day, just like our day, was a seasoning. It was meant to help food taste better. But here's the interesting thing about salt. I love corn on the cob. It's one of my favorite things to eat, especially during the summer. And so if you and I were to sit down to eat some corn on the cob together, you're going to notice that one of the things I do to my corn on the cob is I put some salt on it. And maybe a little bit of butter, too, if I'm not trying to watch the calories on that whole thing. And so what's interesting, though, is that if we eat some corn on the cob together and I get done and I set that empty cob down, I'm not going to look at you and go, "Man, That was some good salt. I'm not going to say that. Why? Because it's not about the salt. Like, I'm going to look at you and say, man, that was some good corn. Because what's the point of the salt? It's to accentuate the flavor that's already there. It's supposed to make you be more excited and experience in a better way the thing with which the salt is associated. And that's what Paul is saying, what Jesus is saying about us. We're to be salt. We're to be seasoning in the world that points people to the goodness of the gospel and the God who loves them with all of his heart. That's our purpose as followers of Jesus. And by the way, that's not new. That's a call that's been on God's people from the very beginning. Like, if you look at the very first portion of the Scriptures called the Old Testament, you're going to find some sections of that are written by a guy named Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was a prophet who spoke on God's behalf to his people, the Israelites. And at one point in Jeremiah's life, he and his people, the Israelites, are taken into captivity by the Babylonians. The nation of Babylon conquers Israel and takes them into captivity, scatters them from their homeland, and makes them live in small groups in different areas of the Babylonian Empire. And in the group that Jeremiah was a part of, there were other prophets who were saying that what God wanted the Israelites to do was to withdraw, was to pull away from Babylonian culture. Don't get involved in the areas that you're in. Don't plan on staying long because this isn't going to last. But the message that God gave his people through Jeremiah was really different. Here's what it said. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your son and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into the exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. What's the call of that passage? Be salt. Be salt. Live for the peace and prosperity of your city. Build houses. Have babies. In fact, have lots of babies. What's the call that God is putting on his people's hearts there? It's to live among the Babylonians, to engage with them so that they can point them to the one true God. That's the call that's on our lives. It's the call that's been on God's people for the entire time that we've existed. We're to be salt that points people to the goodness of God. And the primary place that that's going to play out in your life isn't here at GBC. Like, the primary place that's going to play out isn't through you sitting in a class or through you holding a baby in the nursery, although we'd love you to do that. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But the primary place this is going to play out for you is in your home, is in your workplace. It'll play out in your unique spheres of influence that God has given you to influence, because that's why you're there. You're there to be salt. You're there to be someone that points people to Jesus. It's not like we tease things out from each other. It's not like we've got our work life over here and our spiritual life over here, or our home life over here and our Jesus life over here. Those things are entwined so that wherever you work, wherever you play, whatever you do, wherever you go, the call on your life is to be salt, is to point people to Jesus. And one of the ways that we do that is also wrapped up in this metaphor of salt. Because if you think about it, one of the primary uses of salt in our society is that seasoning idea, but it wasn't in Jesus' day. In fact, the primary use of salt in Jesus' day was to be a preservative. Because Jesus didn't grow up with a refrigerator and a freezer in his house to keep his meat from going bad. And so what Jesus and other people in his culture would do is they would take a ton of salt and rub it into their meat so that it would slow down the decay process and it would last longer. And if you understand what it means that Jesus is saying you're salt, you're a preservative, it will absolutely revolutionize the way that you live your life. Because here's what it means for you to be a preservative. Have you ever noticed that human relationships are constantly descending into chaos? Like, we're constantly getting angry and bitter with each other over stuff. This is something that we recognize internationally, right? Like, relationships between countries are constantly getting worse and decaying, and eventually sometimes they descend into violence and different things like that. But that happens personally as well, doesn't it? Like we're constantly trying to make sure that we get what's ours and that we're completely understood by everybody. And so at the smallest slight, we'll get angry or we'll get bitter with other people, and our relationships will just descend into chaos and decay. I think it's something that we've all experienced here in this room. And what Jesus is saying, that as Christians, as salt, we're to do the opposite. Like we're the ones that overlook a slight. We're the ones that aren't looking to make sure that we get what's ours and make sure that we're perfectly understood. We're not getting angry and bitter at the slightest little thing with everybody else. No, we're a preservative. We're fighting against the decay and the descent into chaos that human relationships typically fall into. And so the first question that I want to ask you this morning is really simple. How salty is your life? Now be careful how you answer that. Because to be salty in our day and age means something a little bit different than what I'm saying. In fact, it means the opposite of what I'm saying. Like if you hear someone salty, they're probably bitter or upset. So that's not what I'm saying. So let's just lean into this so that we can all be on the same page, all right? Do you contribute to the drama that exists in your family, or do you counteract it? Do you participate in the gossip and the slander that happens at work, or do you remove yourself from it and try to stop it? Do you help the tension that exists in your home between you and your spouse or you and your kids? Do you make that get worse, or do you try to resolve it? Now that we're all a little bit uncomfortable, let's just dive into that uncomfortability like with all of us, all right? Do you contribute to the grumbling and complaining that happens in this church, or do you try to stop it from happening? Because that's what it means to be salt. You don't contribute to drama. You don't contribute to gossip. You don't contribute to complaining. You resolve tension. This is what it means for us to be a preservative. And so let me ask you one more time, how salty is your life? Do you find yourself contributing or fighting against the decay that happens so easily in our human relationships? Because that's who Jesus says we should be. Jesus says we're not spectators, we're salt. We're people who point others to the good news of the gospel and the God who loves them behind that gospel. And one of the ways that we do that is by acting like a preservative in our lives who refuses to contribute to the decay that happens in our world. So we're not spectators, we're salt. But then Jesus says that not only are we not spectators and salt, we're also light. You can see this in verse 14 where we read, "You are the light of the world. A city set upon a hill cannot be hidden." So this verse seems like it's just reinforcing the metaphor that we just looked like. It almost feels like Jesus is just saying again the same thing that he just said in a different way, but I don't think that's the case. In fact, I think that these two things are linked together in a really important way. In ancient times, there weren't tons of lights around. And so if you had a city that was on a hill, which by the way, that word town is better translated city. That's why I'm saying city. And so if you had a city that was set on top of a hill or even just a little bit of a rise and it was nighttime, the lamps and the torches in that city could be seen for miles because there wasn't any other light around. And so when you read in the scriptures and you read about light, what's typically being referred to is the idea of truth. Is a revelation of who God is and what he wants for the world. And when you read about the light of the world, it's talking about specifically that revelation of who God is. And what's awesome is the reality that God has most clearly revealed that truth. He shined his light in the world most clearly through Jesus. We talked about this last week, that the clearest example we have of who God is and what he wants is Jesus, because he's the light of the world. Like, you don't have to take my word for that. You can take Jesus's for it, where another close friend and follower of Jesus named John writes an account of Jesus' life for us, and he writes this. He says, when Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." You have to understand that what Jesus just did is he claimed to be God. He claimed to be the light that reveals to us exactly who God is, to the extent that if you will follow after Jesus, you will find life as it was created to be experienced. You will find the life that you've always wanted. That's a big claim. It's a big claim for Jesus to make. And so if he's going to make that claim, he has to back it up. And one of the ways that Jesus backs it up is that all throughout his ministry, you see Jesus over and over again claiming that he is going to die and then rise again. That he's going to die, but he's not going to stay dead. He's going to come back to life. But that's not new with Jesus, is it? Like, there have been plenty of people before Jesus and since Jesus who have claimed to be some kind of divine figure that's going to die and come back to life. And most of the time, we consider those people to be wackos, don't we? And the reason we consider them to be wackos is what? Because despite claiming to be God-like and that they're going to die and come back to life, they die and do what? They stay dead. They don't come back. That's what makes them, that's how you can tell that they were wackos. But so what makes Jesus different from them? Unlike all the wackos before him and since, Jesus predicted his own death and resurrection and actually pulled it off.